Since the dawn of time, the question of evil has haunted both philosophy and theology. How can we reconcile the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God with the presence of suffering, disasters, injustice, and crime in the world? If God is good, why does he allow pain? If he is omnipotent, why does he not prevent it? And if he is omniscient, why did he create a world in which evil exists? This dilemma, known as the problem of evil, has echoed through the centuries, from St. Augustine to Voltaire, passing through Descartes and Spinoza. But it was Leibniz, at the dawn of the 18th century, who offered the most ambitious and systematic attempt to resolve it in his monumental work, Essays on Theodicy. Leibniz does not merely acknowledge the difficulty, he seeks to solve it. He wants to show that the existence of evil is not an objection against God, but rather a proof of divine wisdom. For Leibniz, evil does not exist in itself. It is not a substance, not an independent force, not a positive reality. Evil is a privation, an absence, a limitation. And if God created this world, with all its imperfections and sufferings, it is because this world, despite everything, is the best of all possible worlds. This claim, which may sound shocking or naive, rests on a rigorous logic. God, says Leibniz, is perfect. He knows all possible worlds, all conceivable combinations of events, all the stories the universe could have told. And among this infinity of possible worlds, he chose the one that achieves the greatest balance between good and evil, the one that maximizes overall perfection, the one that allows for universal harmony. This world is not perfect in itself, but it is the best possible one. And evil, far from being an objection to divine goodness, is a relative necessity. It contributes to the overall harmony, like a dissonance in a symphony that enriches the music as a whole. Thus, when Leibniz says that evil does not exist, he does not deny suffering. He simply refuses to regard it as an autonomous reality. Evil is not a force opposing God. It is a limitation inherent to creatures, a consequence of their finitude. Evil is metaphysical because every created being is imperfect. It is physical because pain is part of life. It is moral because human freedom necessarily entails the possibility of error. But in every case, evil has no positive existence. It is always a lack, a deficiency, an imperfection. This vision has inspired both admiration and criticism. Voltaire, in Candide, famously mocked Leibniz's optimism by caricaturing his idea of the best of all possible worlds. Yet behind that satire lies a profound philosophical effort to reconcile reason and faith, freedom and necessity, suffering and harmony. And that is precisely what we will explore in this episode, to understand why, for Leibniz, evil does not truly exist in itself, and why this world, despite all its horrors, remains the best of all possible worlds. Before Leibniz, the question of evil had already been at the heart of Western philosophy and theology. Since antiquity, thinkers had wondered about the origin of suffering and the possibility of reconciling the existence of evil with that of a divine principle. Among the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle had already reflected on the matter. For Plato, evil was tied to the imperfection of matter, to the resistance of the sensible world against the realm of perfect ideas. For Aristotle, it did not exist as a substance, but as a privation, a lack in the fulfillment of form. This notion of privation would profoundly shape the Christian tradition. With Christianity, the problem took on a new dimension. St. Augustine, in the 4th century, was among the first to assert that evil has no positive existence. It is not a creation of God, but an absence of good, a privation. God, being perfectly good, cannot create evil, yet by granting creatures freedom, he allows for the possibility of turning away from him. Moral evil thus arises from the misuse of freedom and physical evil is a consequence of the original fall. This view, which preserves divine goodness, would dominate medieval theology. In the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas took up and systematized this idea. Evil is not a substance, but a privation of good. God, as the first cause, does not create evil. He merely permits that limited, imperfect creatures produce imperfect effects. Yet this explanation, while theologically reassuring, did not entirely dispel the scandal of evil. For why would an all-powerful and all-knowing God choose to create a world in which suffering exists? In the modern era, the question grew more urgent. Descartes, in the 17th century, affirmed that God is perfect and that his works are perfect. But then, how can we explain human error, natural disasters, and injustices? Spinoza, for his part, offered a radical answer. For him, evil does not exist in itself. It is merely a relative idea, born of our limited perspective. In nature, everything is necessary. Everything is an expression of God, and what we call evil is nothing more than the effect of our ignorance. Yet this response, which dissolves evil into universal necessity, seemed unacceptable to many, for it eliminated human freedom and moral responsibility. It was in this context that Pierre Bell, a skeptical philosopher, raised the issue with new sharpness. In his historical and critical dictionary, he argued that the problem of evil is insoluble. If God is all-powerful and good, evil should not exist, yet it does. Therefore, either God is not omnipotent, or he is not good. Bell concluded that reason is incapable of justifying God, and that only faith can accept this mystery. This skeptical stance caused a scandal, for it appeared to undermine the very foundations of rational theology. It was this challenge that Leibniz sought to answer. Confronted with Bell's skepticism, with Spinoza's critiques, and with the unresolved difficulties left by Descartes and the Christian tradition, he undertook to construct a theodicy, that is, a justification of God. His aim was clear, to show that reason can explain why God permitted evil, and that far from being an objection to his goodness, evil is instead a proof of his wisdom. To do so, he developed a bold idea, that this world, despite its imperfections, is the best of all possible worlds. When Leibniz published his essays on theodicy in 1710, he was not merely answering a theological question, but taking on a major philosophical challenge, to show that reason can justify God in the face of the scandal of evil. The word theodicy literally means justification of God. It seeks to demonstrate that the existence of evil is not incompatible with the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God. Where others, like Bell, saw an insoluble contradiction, Leibniz sought to reveal a hidden harmony, a higher logic that could account for this paradox. His central argument became famous. This world is the best of all possible worlds. God, being perfect, knows an infinity of possible worlds, each with its own laws, events, and histories. Out of this infinity, he chooses the one that achieves the greatest balance between good and evil, the one that maximizes overall perfection and allows for universal harmony. This world is not perfect in itself. It contains suffering, injustice, and catastrophe, but it is the best possible world, because any other would have been less harmonious, less rich, less fruitful. Leibniz compares this reasoning to that of a musician or a painter. In a symphony, a dissonance may seem jarring when heard in isolation, yet it takes on meaning within the whole, contributing to the beauty of harmony. In a painting, a shadow might appear ugly on its own, but it gives depth and contrast to the entire composition. In the same way, evil, when seen in isolation, is shocking, but within the totality of the world, it contributes to the general harmony. It is not that God wills evil, but that he allows it to exist because it is the condition for a greater good. Thus, for Leibniz, evil does not exist in itself. It is not a substance, nor an autonomous force. It is a privation, a limitation, an imperfection. Metaphysical evil arises from the finitude of creatures. Only God is perfect, and everything created is limited. Physical evil, suffering, disasters, results from this limitation. Moral evil, sin, stems from human freedom, which implies the possibility of error. But in every case, evil has no positive existence. It is always an absence, a defect, a lack. This vision allows Leibniz to preserve both the goodness and the omnipotence of God. God is not the author of evil, since evil does not exist as a substance. Yet he permits it, because it is the necessary condition for a richer, more harmonious, more perfect whole. This world, with all its suffering and injustice, is nonetheless the best of all possible worlds. It is a bold thesis, one that has inspired both admiration and criticism. It offers a rational response to the problem of evil, yet it shocks by its optimism. For how can one say, in the face of wars, famines, and disasters, that this world is the best possible? How can one not see in such a claim a kind of naivete? That is precisely what Voltaire would mock in Candide. But before turning to those critiques, we must grasp the depth of Leibniz's thought. Far from being a mere formula, the best of all possible worlds is an attempt to reconcile reason, faith, and the human experience of suffering. To understand the depth of Leibniz's thought, one must enter into his famous distinction between the three forms of evil: metaphysical evil, physical evil, and moral evil. This classification is not a mere exercise in vocabulary. It reveals that evil, far from being an autonomous force, is always a consequence of the finitude of creatures and of the order of the world. In other words, evil does not exist in itself. It is always relative, derivative, and secondary. Metaphysical evil is the most fundamental. It does not refer to any particular suffering, but to the inherent limitation of all created beings. Only God is perfect, infinite, and without defect. Everything created is necessarily limited, imperfect, and finite. This limitation is already a form of evil, for it means that creatures cannot do everything, do not know everything, and do not possess all perfections. Metaphysical evil is therefore inevitable. It is inscribed in the very condition of created being. To wish for a world without metaphysical evil would be to wish for a world in which all creatures were God himself, which is a contradiction. Physical evil is the one we experience most directly: pain, suffering, disease, natural disasters, and accidents. It arises as a consequence of our finitude. Because we are limited beings, we are exposed to suffering. Yet for Leibniz, physical evil is not absurd. It plays a role in the harmony of the world. Pain, for instance, serves a purpose. It warns us of danger, prompting us to protect our bodies. Natural disasters, however terrible, contribute to the overall balance of nature. Thus, physical evil is not senseless. It is a necessary consequence of the world's order. Finally, moral evil is the one that most deeply scandalizes us. Sin, injustice, cruelty, and human wickedness. It originates in the freedom of rational creatures. By creating free beings, God gave them the ability to choose the good, but also the possibility of erring and acting wrongly. Moral evil is therefore the price of freedom. Without freedom, there would be no responsibility, no merit, no genuine morality. God therefore allows moral evil, not because he wills it, but because it is inseparable from freedom, and freedom is a greater good than the mere absence of sin. By distinguishing these three forms of evil, Leibniz shows that evil is never a substance, never a positive force. Metaphysical evil is the limitation of creatures. Physical evil is a consequence of that limitation, and moral evil is the misuse of freedom. In every case, Evil does not exist in itself. It is always a privation, an absence, an imperfection. And this is why it does not contradict God's goodness. For God did not create evil. He created limited beings, and evil necessarily follows from that limitation. This classification enables Leibniz to respond to the scandal of evil. It shows that evil, far from being an objection against God, is an inevitable consequence of creation. It also helps us understand why this world, despite its suffering and injustices, can still be the best of all possible worlds, because any other world would have involved other limitations, other sufferings, other faults. Evil, then, is inevitable, but it is integrated into a broader harmony, one that makes this world the most perfect possible. For Leibniz, to claim that evil does not exist does not mean denying the reality of suffering, injustice, or catastrophe. It is not a matter of closing one's eyes to human pain, but of refusing to see evil as a substance, as an autonomous force opposed to good. Evil, he says, has no positive existence. It is always a privation, an absence, a limitation. This idea, inherited from St. Augustine and the Christian tradition, is taken up and radicalized by Leibniz in his theodicy. Metaphysical evil, for example, is nothing more than the finitude of creatures. To be limited, to not be God, is already to bear a kind of deficiency. But this deficiency is not a reality in itself. It is simply the absence of perfection. Similarly, physical evil, or suffering, is not a positive force. It is the sign of a defect, an imbalance, a limitation in the natural order. As for moral evil, sin, it is not a substance created by God. It is the misuse of freedom, that is, a privation of rectitude in the human will. In every case, evil is never a thing, but always a defect. This conception allows Leibniz to defend divine goodness. If evil does not exist in itself, then God is not its author. He did not create evil. He created limited beings, and evil necessarily follows from that limitation. But this evil, being a privation, does not possess the same reality as good. Good is positive. It is fullness. It is perfection. Evil, by contrast, is always secondary, derivative, relative. It has no independent substance. That is why Leibniz can say that this world, despite its sufferings, is the best of all possible worlds. For evil, far from being a force that destroys harmony, is a relative component of it. Like a shadow in a painting, it highlights the light. Like a dissonance in a symphony, it enriches the harmony. Evil is not an absurdity, but a relative necessity that contributes to the overall balance. This vision is deeply optimistic, but also demanding. It requires us to change our way of looking at suffering. It invites us not to see evil as an autonomous power, but as a limitation inscribed in the order of the world. It urges us to seek, beyond appearances, the hidden harmony that makes this world the best possible. By asserting that evil does not exist, Leibniz does not deny pain. He simply refuses to grant it ontological dignity. He reduces it to a privation, an absence, a limit. And in doing so, he preserves God's goodness while giving meaning to the existence of evil. When Leibniz published his theodicy in 1710, he proposed an ambitious vision that this world, despite its imperfections, is the best of all possible worlds. Yet this thesis, rigorous as it was, would soon be simplified, caricatured, and attacked with unprecedented vigor. The most famous of his critics was Voltaire, who, in his philosophical tale Candide, 1759, turned Leibnizian optimism into a target of biting satire. To understand the force of this critique, one must place it in context. The 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, was marked by a determination to confront philosophical systems with the concrete realities of human experience, especially with the disasters that shook Europe. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 was a decisive event. The city was destroyed, tens of thousands perished, and all of Europe was shaken. How could such horror be reconciled with the idea of a world created by a good and wise God? For many, this catastrophe seemed to refute Leibniz's optimism. Deeply moved, Voltaire first wrote his poem on the Lisbon disaster, rejecting the idea that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. A few years later, he published Candide, in which he portrayed a naive disciple of optimistic philosophy, Pangloss, who endlessly repeats that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, even in the face of the worst atrocities. Voltaire's critique is devastating, but it rests on a simplification. Leibniz never claimed that everything is good, nor that every particular event is good in itself. He said that the world as a whole is the best possible. The distinction is crucial. A particular evil may exist, but it contributes to a greater harmony. By reducing this nuanced thesis to a naive formula, Voltaire turns optimism into caricature. Pangloss becomes the emblem of a blind philosophy, incapable of confronting the reality of suffering. Yet Leibniz's thought is far more subtle. He distinguishes between three kinds of evil: metaphysical, physical, and moral. He acknowledges suffering. He does not deny it. But he affirms that it is inevitable in any created world and that it can be integrated into a broader harmony. Voltaire, by contrast, rejects such justification. For him, suffering is a scandal that no theory can excuse. His irony aims to show that optimism, far from consoling us, adds absurdity to pain. It transforms suffering into necessity and thereby, in a sense, legitimizes it. The reception of Leibniz was long shaped by this caricature. For centuries, Leibnizian optimism was reduced to Pangloss's formula. The depth of the theodicy, its metaphysical logic, its attempt to reconcile reason and faith, was largely forgotten. What remained was the image of a naive philosopher, blind to the horrors of the world. Yet this image is unjust. Leibniz was no blissful optimist. He was a rationalist seeking to understand why God chose this world rather than another. His optimism was not a denial of evil, but an attempt to integrate it within a coherent vision of the universe. Beyond Voltaire, other critics also pointed out the limits of Leibniz's thesis. Some accused him of justifying suffering too easily, of turning evil into a mere decorative element in a higher harmony. Others saw in his system a form of determinism that diminished human freedom. Yet his position remains one of the most ambitious attempts to resolve the problem of evil. It rejects Bell's skepticism, which viewed evil as an insoluble objection, and Spinoza's view, which dissolves evil into universal necessity. Leibniz proposes a middle path, to acknowledge evil, but to understand it as privation, and to integrate it into a global harmony. Even today, Voltaire's critique continues to shape the way Leibniz is received. The word optimism is often used pejoratively, as a synonym for naivete. But returning to the text reveals a far richer, more nuanced, and more demanding thought. Leibniz does not say that everything is good. He says that everything contributes to a greater good. He does not deny suffering. He seeks to give it meaning. And perhaps this is where the power of his philosophy lies, in his refusal to yield to despair, in his effort to find reason even within the absurd, in his conviction that the universe, despite its shadows, is ordered by a higher wisdom. To conclude a journey through Leibniz's thought is to return to a question that has never ceased to haunt humanity. How can we understand evil? How can we make sense of suffering, injustice, and catastrophe without giving up the idea of order, rationality, and harmony in the world? With his theodicy, Leibniz offered a response that, 3 centuries later, continues to fascinate and divide. For him, evil does not exist in itself. It is never a substance, never an autonomous force, but always a privation, a limitation, a consequence of the finitude of created beings. And this world, despite its shadows, is the best of all possible worlds, because it achieves the richest, most harmonious, and most fruitful balance between good and evil. This thesis, mocked by Voltaire and caricatured through the figure of Pangloss, has often been reduced to a naive formula. But beyond the caricature lies a thought of extraordinary boldness. Leibniz does not deny suffering. He seeks to integrate it into a coherent vision of the universe. He does not turn away from evil. He understands it as a relative necessity inscribed within the order of creation. His optimism is not frivolous. It is demanding. It rests on the conviction that reason can illuminate even darkness, that harmony may be hidden within dissonance, and that divine wisdom can manifest itself even through the imperfections of creation. Today, this vision retains a remarkable power. In a world marked by wars, crises, and natural disasters, the problem of evil remains as urgent as ever. The same objections raised by Voltaire still echo. How can we speak of the best of all possible worlds in the face of history's horrors? And yet, Leibniz's perspective invites both lucidity and hope. It reminds us that evil, however scandalous, does not have the final word, that it is relative, secondary, derivative, and that it can be integrated into a broader harmony, one that we may not always perceive, but that nonetheless exists. Leibniz's conclusion is not an easy consolation. It does not erase pain or deny injustice, but it offers a way of thinking about the world that refuses despair. It affirms that reason can still find meaning, that creation is not absurd, that life, despite its shadows, is governed by a higher wisdom. And perhaps this, ultimately, is Leibniz's most precious legacy, an invitation to face evil without surrendering to nihilism, to seek harmony behind dissonance, and to believe that this world, with all its limitations, is nevertheless the best of all possible worlds.